Good evening, everybody, and welcome to a special edition of The Agenda. Tonight we are live at the Munk Center for International Studies on the downtown campus of the University of Toronto, our kind of home away from home from TVO. In the audience tonight, University of Toronto students, plus members of the general community who signed up at tvo.org/theagenda to participate in our program. We want to remind you of a couple of items of business just before we introduce our guests this evening and get our discussion underway. We would love your emails, which we will try to put as many as possible to our guests. So email us at theagenda@tvo.org. We'll try to include as many as we can. Also, for the first time for us here at the Munk Center, we want you to stay tuned after the broadcast ends. In other words, after 9 o'clock Eastern Time, where we'll continue the discussion with an exclusive online video chat, and that will take place at tvo.org/theagenda, our homepage. So go that, and our guests will stick around, our audience will stick around, and we'll just continue the conversation that we've had for the previous hour during the broadcast. Okay, joining us now on the debate, Margaret Wente, columnist with the Globe and Mail, Benoit Thomas, editor of the Indo-Canadian newspaper The Weekly Voice, Mohammed Boujanan, executive director of the Canadian Arab Federation, Jeffrey Reitz, professor of sociology at the U of T and co-author of the just-released study Racial Inequality, Social Cohesion and Policy Issues in Canada for the Institute for Research and Public Policy, Sita Ramkalawansing, manager of diversity and community engagement for the City of Toronto. And can you have too many Globe and Mail reporters or columnists at a debate? No, you cannot. So we've asked John Ibbotson from the Globe and Mail to join us as well. Welcome, everybody. It's great to have you here at the Munk Center tonight. Before we start our debate, I do want to pull some more numbers out of Jeffrey Reitz's study and put them up on the screen here for our viewers to see as well, because this study just came out and it has some most fascinating developments. The racial or visible minorities as a share of immigration to Canada. In 1960 or before, Jeffrey Reitz's study says 10%. In the 1970s, that skyrockets to 52%. In the 1980s, 65%. In the 1990s, fully 75% of Canadian immigrants were from so-called racial or visible minority communities. Which communities were those? Let's take a look. The Chinese community made up 3.4%, South Asian communities 3.1%, the Black communities 2.2%. And let's pull the numbers apart even more. Racial minorities represented 1% of the population in 1971 and 13% in the year 2001. By the year 2017, racial minorities will constitute 20% of Canada's population. As you might expect, Toronto and Vancouver are expected by that time to have the majority of their populations consisting of racial minorities. Now let's get one more piece of tape on this just before we go to our debaters, and that is from the Swiss Muslim thinker Tariq Ramadan, whose grandfather, you may remember, founded the Muslim Brotherhood. Here's what he has to say about this so-called notion of us versus them. Roll tape, Michael.
When we speak about integration, we are asking someone, a man or a woman, or a group of men or women, or a whole community, if you come to a country, integrate within the reality, the history, the memory, the psychology, the culture of this country, which is right, which is understandable. And this is the progressive understanding. You can remain who you are, but you cannot neglect where you are. What we are building out of this understanding of integration is a binary vision of reality. It's us protecting ourselves from them. They may be the majority, they may be the surrounding society. And even though we don't say it and we don't repeat it, it's here in our mind, us and them. So how do you build the unity of a society if within this society there is this perpetual reference to us and them, us and them?
Tariq Ramadan. Okay, Jeffrey Seitz, let's unpack some of the numbers of your study. One of the things you found is that the children of immigrants experience higher levels of discrimination and in significant numbers do not identify with Canada. Now that goes against logic where you assume that the longer people spend in this country, the more Canadian they would feel. You say it's not the case. Why do you think not?
Well, the experience of immigrants is very different from the experience of their children. Immigrants come to Canada because they want to improve their lives. And many of them do that, in fact, and they come to Canada and they compare themselves not with other Canadians in terms of how they feel about the situation, but they compare themselves with where they came from, their situation then. And of course, if some of them are unhappy, many of them who are unhappy leave. About a third of immigrants leave within a few years of arriving in Canada. So the ones who are remaining are the ones who are relatively happy here. So that's their situation. What about the children? If they run into trouble, of course, they have no place to go. They're Canadians. This is their place. This is their home. And as well, they decide when they're evaluating their circumstances, they compare themselves with other Canadians. They've grown up here. They know there's supposed to be equality in this country. And so I think they may look at the situation a little bit differently and more with an expectation for equality than their parents.
Let's do a little breakdown into some more ethnic groups to see how the children of immigrants, whether they think of themselves as Canadians or not. And again, this is from your study. How many children of immigrants do not think of themselves as Canadians? The whites surveyed, 22% said they didn't. Of Chinese Canadians, 40% didn't. In the South Asian community, 46% didn't. In the black communities, fully 50% did not think of themselves as Canadians. This is the second generation. Total from the so-called visible minority communities, 43%. What do these numbers tell you about how well Canada is integrating its immigrant population?
Well, we looked at a number of aspects of integration, and identification with Canada was only one of them. But then the question specifically that was asked, and this is a Statistics Canada study, asked of 40,000 people across the country, what is your ethnic or cultural identity? And this is after a series of questions about ancestry, so they're asking them about their identity. And the word Canada wasn't used and no examples were given. And people were allowed to mention up to 6 responses to that. So what we did was we counted the number where a person mentioned Canada, Canadian, as any one of those 6. And so this is something that people are bringing forward. And what we found was a difference by race in the prevalence or the extent to which people mentioned Canadian. But that's just one of the indicators. We looked at participation in the community. We looked at general sense of well-being, life satisfaction, trust in others, sense of belonging.
How about income?
Now, that's a very, very interesting question, because that was actually the issue that had motivated our study. We knew that immigrants, and to some extent the children of immigrants, ran into trouble in the labor market, that they weren't as successful as they might have been expecting to be based on their education. So we wondered if that was translating into the social side. We found actually that it didn't, that the sense of being Canadian or participating in the Canadian community wasn't actually affected by levels of income. It was affected, though, by whether people felt that they had been treated fairly in their dealings in the workplace and in other areas of the society.
Once upon a time, the attitude, I think it's fair to say, among many in society towards immigrants was they got to learn to swim or they sink. How about today? What's the attitude today?
Among the immigrants themselves,
yeah,
or in the general
among
population?
The immigrants.
Well, immigrants, they're a hardy bunch of people. These are people who, in many instances, have gotten up from where they were. They want to improve their lives. They've moved halfway around the planet. So these people tend to be energetic, ambitious people. We know that they're healthier on average than other Canadians. And they're looking to improve their lives. And so I think that they are an upbeat bunch, and they're not inclined to complain when difficulties arise. The complaining, as you've mentioned, the survey data show that the complaining is done by their children more than by the immigrants themselves.
Okay, Sita, let me bring you into this. You have your perch at City Hall from which you study and analyze these issues. Is what you've heard so far from Jeffrey's study consistent with what you see?
Not entirely. The question that I asked Jeffrey earlier was this definition of what does it feel to be Canadian? What actually did they mean by to be a Canadian? Is it because they're thinking of the mainstream institutions as them not being part of it? I think that, from my perch, I think that, kids, from what we've seen, they actually want to be part of the society. People who come and make grant applications to us, 40% of people who participate in my program want to be part of the civic discourse. But I think, I would actually like to have dissected Jeffrey's study a bit further in terms of, what did they mean by, do you feel Canadian? Because I think if you were able to ask the children or the young people, what did they mean by that when they said, I don't feel Canadian, I think you might actually get a completely different
No, they
answer.
didn't, but they didn't say they didn't feel Canadian.
Well-
They just didn't happen to mention Canadian
Right.
as often when we asked them about their ethnic
Right,
or
okay.
cultural identification. And the key thing is not so much whether they did or didn't, in a way, it's the difference between racial groups in the way that they handle that particular issue. And as I mentioned to Steve, it's not just the Canadian identification. That wasn't the only issue that we looked at. We looked at a whole series of indicators, and they all showed a racial difference. In my mind, one of the ones that is more concern is the lower rate of voting and the participation in the political
But let me find out
process.
from Sita, do you find these figures alarming?
No, I don't, because I think it's a study, and I think that people's lived experience may be a bit different. I think young people feel, by and large, very positive about being in Canada. The fact that they may have differences in their attitude towards the country from their parents is just a matter of having a different lived experience from their parents. But that's not, I think, how young people see themselves in the city.
Here's how John Ibbotson put it. John, you write so nicely. We owe our success as a country to our failure as a nation. You want to explain what you meant by that?
Yeah, well, I have the most difficult of tasks. I'm an optimistic columnist, at least on this one particular subject. It's a tough road to hoe. But I think we're actually doing a very good job at this. I think Canada is doing better than any other country in the world at integrating immigrants.
Despite what those numbers say.
Despite what those numbers say. And the reason we're doing a better job than any other country in the world is that, first of all, we're taking in more immigrants than anybody else on a per capita basis. And we're doing it because Canada, as I said, never really gelled as a nation state. It never had the experience of centuries of culture and even genetic uniqueness that you will find in places like Denmark, say, or France or Switzerland. Whether you want to say it was because of the French-English divide or whether it was the vast distances and the disparate populations, the country never really came together in the sense of Canada, the nation state. And we remember all those dreary debates that we had in the 60s and 70s about why isn't Canada really a country and what does it mean to be Canadian? Well, the great news about that is that it does make it much easier for this country to take people from Manila or Beijing or anywhere else on the planet and put them in here, because it's a very basic template. There are a set of laws, there's a constitution, you have to obey them, vote if you get a chance, try to remember the first verse of the national anthem. They keep changing it though. So it makes it much easier, say, for, as I've said before, an engineer from Manila who has to choose between Vancouver and Copenhagen to choose Vancouver, because she won't have the obstacles to integrating into the society in Vancouver that she will have in Copenhagen. Okay. So in fact, I think it's working, and there are problems, and by all means we need to discuss them and debate them, but let's not write it off.
Well, all right, let's go to your colleague Margot Wendt, who just got back from quite a fascinating trip to Europe. I read your columns about your trip to Europe, your impressions of immigrants who are trying to integrate into the European society. Give us a thumbnail sketch, first of all, of the impressions you came back with when studying that.
It is very, very tough for just the reasons that John said. Every European country is essentially homogeneous. It's essentially a tribe with very deep ethnic roots. In Germany, for example, the definition of a German for a long time was somebody with German blood. And if you come from anywhere else in the world, you don't have German blood, forget it. You can't ever really be German. Even in Sweden, which is the most progressive, most tolerant, most non-racist country in the whole world, or at least that's the way they like to think of themselves, but they're among the most homogeneous people on the face of the earth. And it's almost impossible for a non-ethnic Swede ever to become truly Swedish. I think the thing that Canada has going for it, and by the way, everybody in Europe said, how do you guys do it? What's your secret? And I said, well, one secret is there's no such thing as an ethnic Canadian.
So they think we're on the right track.
Oh, absolutely. We are the envy of the world. I have to tell you that. It's true.
Two optimistic Globe columnists in the same place? I don't know if I can handle this all in one time. Is there a lesson for Canada in what you learned from your experience in Europe?
I think, yeah, culture matters tremendously. History matters tremendously. And our lack of history is, in fact, a big advantage. It's a big advantage.
Mohammed, first of all, welcome back to TVO.
Thank you.
Many of our viewers will remember you when you were on our French sister station TFO, so welcome back. Many of the anxieties, I think it's fair to say, having to do with multiculturalism lately have been seen through the prism of Muslim relations. What is your sense of how Arab immigrants are integrating into Canada today?
Well, let me go back to a couple of those comments earlier. I think it's not very fair to compare the immigration history and immigration system in Canada with Europe. It's completely different. I think we should compare ourselves to countries like Australia, New Zealand, and maybe United States, because we have almost the same process. And those countries adopted another style of integrating their communities and their racial minority groups, and it's horrible. Of course, as a Canadian, we should congratulate ourselves. But that have been said, we don't bring immigrants here out of generosity. We need them. I mean, the minority of people who come here as a refugee or political asylum seekers or whatever are a small group of people. Canada need immigrants. We bring them because we need them. That have been said, if you bring someone from another country, and God knows we have one of the most restrictive, selective process to come to Canada, you expect to provide with them with certain chances and certain process where they have a chance to enhance their quality of life, where they have a chance to participate in the political process, where they have a chance to grow as a citizen. Now, as Professor Reed said, the first generation of immigrants sacrifice that right in a way for the second generation. But the second generation don't have my accent when they speak English. They know about tie domi and the maple leaves. They know about Canadiana. They have a certain reference and cultural reference. Of course, they expect to be treated like the white, dominant Anglo-Saxon groups outside Quebec and the French Canadian in Quebec.
And in your experience, is that happening?
Of course it's happening. I mean, recently the Sun released a poll about racist attitude or xenophobia. And Arabs and Muslims, especially Arabs, are the least liked in Canada. And that's, of course, came in a context of September 11. It came in a context where we have a public discourse with negatives and racial towards those groups. And of course, those kids won't feel Canadian. Even as I said, if they speak proper English or proper French, even if they know about Canadian culture, they feel marginalized because they don't have access.
Well, I don't have to tell anybody in this gathering or in this room, I suspect, about the situation not that long ago with Sharia law, where I guess some people in the Muslim community wanted Sharia law as an option available to them to solve disputes within the community. Many people in Ontario didn't like that idea. The Premier of the day came in and drew a line in the sand and said, can't do it. Do immigrants have to leave some of their culture of the old world behind if they want to live among us?
Well, the reality, I will answer with this quotation by Jean-Paul Sartre, who said in French, "Ma liberté s'arrête là où commence celle des autres." My freedom stops where others' freedom begin. It makes sense. As a community, we do expect people who came here to respect the fundamental law of this country. As Canadian, we do expect people who come here to respect gender equality, to respect the fundamental principle of democracy, justice, and equity. But on the other hand, we also have to be tolerant and open. And the Sharia law, in my sense, was a completely wrong debate. It was a false debate. It was used and misused for different interests, and I don't want to go there. But as a Canadian, we do have to be flexible. We do have to be open, but of course we have to expect people who come here to respect the law of the land.
Benoit, let me follow up with you. One of the stats mentioned in Jeff Wright's study is that while 93% of Canadians favor non-white immigration, they show very little interest in socializing with non-whites. And I'd like to get your sense of the importance of that number.
Yeah, first of all, there's no choice for the Canadians because which white people are going to come to Canada anyway? I don't think Europeans are interested in coming to Canada because this is not a lifestyle or a standard of living. I guess it is lower than what the Western Europeans enjoy today. The only kind of white people who are interested in coming who are coming are from the former Soviet Republic, Eastern Europe. And their standard of living is very low, perhaps lower than some of the what we call third world countries. So that's a few white people who come here. The rest, we have no choice. We have people from Africa to Asia to China coming here. And
let me follow up with this. Do members of the Indian community feel the lack of social intercourse as an indication of racism or disrespect or what?
No, it's just lack of opportunities. I was telling Margaret that, I'm glad to be with so many white people, because normally in my situation, I don't get to talk to maybe the guy or the UPS guy is often black, or the Christmas time the guy who comes around selling $10 stuff, he's white and 18-year-old. So I mean, there's very little interaction with the white community, and in my position, if that's true, I can imagine most of my people, or you know, the community that I represent, South Asians, they have very little interaction. In fact, some of them really go out of their way to invite some very nasty people from their neighborhood just to make sure that we are Canadians. We rub shoulders with the white people.
I'm just curious. It's pretty obvious Margaret Wente is white. The guy sitting on the other side of you,
Yes.
do you think he's white?
He's, according to us, he's brown, just like.
Because we're throwing around labels here.
We call ourselves. They distinctly here there are three colors, right? I mean, I was telling your makeup woman. I mean, like, do you? I said, do you do the same kind of makeup for all colors? She said no, because he was on the chair. I was looking at him; he was almost white. So, but she said no, he's not white. He's got a different kind of colors that's going in. And for me, she had a different one, and for Jeffrey, she had a different one. She said she has makeup, you know, for different skin tones, and we have all those. I guess she has to be.
Because I got to tell you, it may be that I don't have my glasses on tonight, but when I look at Mohammed Boujanan, who you're born in Morocco?
That's right.
And when I look at John Ibbotson, who came over on the Mayflower, you both look pretty white to me. Is that, am I wrong about this?
Well,
Yeah, to me, yeah, I wouldn't have known them. And not if it is one of these cloudy days. No,
it's also probably a false debate to try to even cast it in terms of skin culture.
That's right.
Okay.
It's skin color. It is certainly much more one of culture. And it's always been with us, let's not forget. It might not have been racially defined. Originally, it was religiously defined. If you were an Irish Catholic kid growing up in the Ottawa Valley in the 1800s, you grew up largely with other Irish Catholic kids. There was a strong sense of exclusion between the Protestant and Catholic cultures in Ontario. And it took a long time to break that down. If you were coming over from South Europe, Italy probably, or maybe Portugal, or Eastern Europe after the war, you lived in Little Italy or Little Portugal, and you probably kept within that community. It takes a while for immigrant cultures to blend in and become part of the larger culture, changing that larger culture, by the way, in the process. So, you know, I don't think we should pound our heads against walls too much just because everything is not sweetness and light immediately. Gotcha. It takes time.
Margaret.
I hate to say it, John, but I agree with you. You know, this idea where there is in the world, or is or has been some paradise where everybody gets along, is a fantasy. I mean, human beings are deeply, deeply tribal by instinct. And to overcome that tribalism is what the progress of civilization is all about. But if given if our natural instincts are to huddle together with people who are just like us, people come here from someplace else. Where do they go? They go to the community or the suburb where everybody else is like them and comes from the same place. Because that's where your comfort zone is. That's where your food is. That's where your language is. That's where your culture is. That's where you're comfortable. You know, my husband grew up in rural Quebec, and he tells wonderful stories about how the French Protestants fought with French Catholics, and they fought with English Protestants, and they fought with the English Catholics, and everybody fought with everybody else. That's, overcoming that is what civilization is all about, and it's hard.
Sita.
So I wanted to comment on the point that was being made about social interaction, and one of the indicators of that is interracial marriage. And one of the things that we've actually observed in this country is a 35% increase in the last 10 to 15 years. And if that is not an indication of, how people feel about their culture, or they're beginning to relate to other people as human beings and not as being grounded in no culture, that's a sign of that.
An indication that we're a more colorblind society today.
We're becoming more integrated and no, I don't think we'll ever be culture blind, because I think I think the black community would have a lot of things to say about profiling and how they're treated by institutions.
Jeffrey.
I want to say something about what research says about white people. First of all, Statistics Canada defines a white person. They have a measure. They ask, are you? And one of the response options is white. And the other response options are black, which is another color, but then Chinese, Korean, and they have a bunch of names of countries or nationalities. But that's how they define what a visible minority is, someone who says they're not white. And it's interesting that the people, for example, of Middle Eastern background, about 25% of them say that they're white. But what the research shows about white people in Canada is that they tend, as a rule, to discount the problems of racial minorities. We know that. That's what they tell people who are conducting interview surveys. So racial minorities report that they experience discrimination. White people tend to discount its significance. And it seems to me that that is an issue, a difference of opinion about the significance of that issue in Canada. And I think it is, you might say, a research question, but it would be important to get at the underlying facts so that there actually can be a discussion between the two, rather than simply having the dominant group announce that there are no problems, which is what you often see. And they call themselves optimists.
I think the debate about multiculturalism, is it working or it's not working, it's a right debate, but in a way I think multiculturalism now in Canada needs to be rethinked, needs to be looked at in a different eye, because of course through history we know now the immigration who comes to Canada is not a white immigration. It's racially diverse, religiously diverse, and they have also, they bring with them issues. There's international context, and we're not like completely isolated from the international context. Actually, Canadian needs to learn more about what's happening outside Canada.
Sure.
And that's important. Maybe in our school system we need to look at that.
You've led me nicely to where we want to go next, which is the notion of multiculturalism and how we're doing it today. And Jeffrey, again, from your study, much of the research that has been done has shown that the more multicultural a society is, the less people trust each other. Is it possible that multiculturalism is undermining social cohesiveness? What do you say?
Well, that multiculturalism itself, if multiculturalism is, as we define it in Canada, a set of principles of inclusion of minority groups and encouraging them where they want to maintain their culture, that's certainly not dividing people in any way. The research that shows a negative relationship between diversity and trust, a lot of that, it comes basically as Robert Putnam's research in the United States. And we're talking, and his ethnic groups that he considers are blacks and Hispanics primarily. And of course, they experience enormous inequalities and marginalization in society. So that's where the generalization comes from. I don't think that it applies anywhere near to that extent in Canada.
Okay. Every time we do a program in the Munk Center, Janice Stein is usually on the program, but she's out of town tonight. So we have to quote her because she's not here. Let's bring this up, Michael. Here's Janice Stein editing a collection of essays. I believe John Ibbotson's done one of the essays as well. And she says, deep multiculturalism builds bridges across cultures. Shallow multiculturalism can strengthen each culture within its own boundaries. Each community can learn its own language, its own history, its songs, its poetry, but one community does not necessarily learn about another. And then multiculturalism can have perverse effects. It can strengthen the boundaries around each community, and in doing so, help to seal one community off from another. That's what I was referring to, Jeffrey, and I guess I want to ask Benoit, do we need a deeper multiculturalism in this country today?
We need to throw it out as soon as possible.
Throw it out?
Throw it out of the window.
And replace it with what?
Totally. We don't need it. I thought Harper had it right when he didn't appoint a minister for multiculturalism for the first time in a decade or so. But I guess multiculturalism is a vote-catching gimmick. I don't know how it began. I was not here in this country at that time. But soon after the charter, I mean, they thought about how to... You don't need multiculturalism if you really read up the charter. I mean, like there's everything that we need, cultural communities need, it's all there to protect our rights. Multiculturalism is nothing but a vote catching by the ruling parties. And I think that's what Harper, by reinstating that position, he is giving into the same kind of trickery,
So you think
which is multiculturalism.
the appointment of Jason Kenney
Because
in that cabinet job?
how else can you distribute mega millions to
Well, keep
your
in
own
mind, the
political
portfolio
supporters?
has two. John Ibbotson, I should bring you in here because the portfolio has two names. It's not just multiculturalism, it's Canadian identity, which means a little something for everybody, perhaps?
That's what I was going to say next.
Yeah.
What we need to, not to call it multiculturalism, but something, a ministry of immigrant welfare and integration, something that is positive. and not something that is vague and useless like multiculturalism.
John, let me get you
See,
on that.
I have two. First of all, Janice and I disagree on this, I think, rather profoundly. I, first of all, don't even know what multiculturalism is. I mean, it's even in the Charter, but what law is there regarding multiculturalism? What actual, things are in place to make us multicultural as opposed to things that are in place in New Zealand that are not? No one's ever been able to explain to me just what exactly multiculturalism is as a statute, rather than just as a policy or
You
spending
understand
money
it
on.
as a broad statement, don't you? As a broad undertaking?
It's a value, I
Yeah,
suppose.
yeah.
But my real problem with Janice and others who are making her argument, when they talk about the fact that we need to redefine citizenship, or we need to come up with a stronger sense of what it means to be Canadian, and to make sure that new arrivals integrate. Well, what exactly are they proposing? What are we talking about here? First of all, you try to define me Canadian, and I'll give you $20 because I've never heard anybody do it any better than they do defining multiculturalism. The sort of the polite agreement not to try to nail any of this stuff down is what keeps the country functioning. But if you did say that, all right, we're going to really take steps to make sure that everyone coming into this country really is Canadian, what? How? What concretely do you want loyalty oaths? Do you want new definitions of citizenship? Do you want two-tiered citizenship? What specifically are these people who are saying that we need to have a deeper and more entrenched multiculturalism proposing for us?
Let me throw it out. You got to know English or French, and you got to have some understanding of the history of the country. How's that?
My understanding is that having some knowledge of English or French is especially for economic immigrants, already a criterion. And having some knowledge of the history of the country is something that happens during the course of taking your citizenship oath. Now, we have a problem with voting, and we maybe need to think more about the curriculums in schools to emphasize the history curriculum more and the civics curriculum more. That's something we can discuss. But I don't think it's my obligation to come up with ideas for this. What I need to hear is from other people what it is they're proposing, so we can actually get a handle on it and find out whether they are in fact trying to come up with different notions of citizenship.
I want to know if CETA is going to defend multiculturalism in Canada today.
I am, and I will.
Go ahead.
I think that the concept, the principle of multiculturalism is really, created an environment in which people who were neither English nor French felt that they belonged and were part of Canada, which is what I think that what Pierre Trudeau was aiming towards, a sense that your own identity, your own heritage, your own culture had some value. And I think that it's very important for each person in a society to feel that they have an identity, whatever that is.
But 40 years later, do people in so-called multicultural communities now feel that they're somehow ghettoized or marginalized because we call them multicultural?
Well, I think that there is a lot of, misuse of the word what is a multicultural community? We are a multicultural society because we have people we have a multitude of cultures in the society. I think that the ghettoization takes place when there isn't sufficient integration, where people are ghettoized because they don't have employment, where they live in, where they're isolated, where they can't participate in the mainstream institutions. But that doesn't have anything to do with the concept of multiculturalism.
Jeffrey, you want to follow up on this?
Well, yes, I've seen a shred of evidence that suggests that multiculturalism is undermining Canadian unity in any way. And certainly the tendency for immigrants to live in particular communities is not new. It's not new with racial minorities. It has nothing to do with why racial minorities may be feeling more estranged from our community. I think whether multiculturalism is an issue or not will be determined when we bring in more members of racial minorities into public discussion. What's actually happening is that those minorities are not participating. Most of the debate is among white people. Most of the political representatives are white people. Most of those running for office are white people, and minorities are not voting. It seems to me that in order to even find out what the issues are, we have to bring them into the process.
Let me introduce you to Tony Nardi. Tony's got a one-man show that's been around town for several weeks now. I went to see it a few weeks ago. It's provocative as hell, I don't mind telling you. It's about ethnic stereotyping. Well, it starts there and goes all over the place, but thanks for coming tonight. You wanted to say what?
Well, I have a question for the panel. If numerical superiority defines the pot we're all supposed to melt into, and at this point it's defined by the ethnic communities of English and French Canada, what happens with that numerical superiority switches to another ethnic group? Or will the Civil War define that?
Interesting. Who wants in on that? Anybody? That's a good
What's
question.
gonna
It's left
happen?
them speechless.
Are you saying what's going to happen when, if, for example, in Toronto, as will happen by 2017, the majority of the population,
Already 43%.
the city of Toronto,
The
but
city of
that's your
Toronto.
concern, the city. But I'm talking about the metropolitan area,
Yeah, well,
which is now around 40%, and but will become 50. The entire Toronto community will be 50% of non-European background. Whether or not individual group members feel like they are in the majority simply because all visible minorities are majority, I don't know. I doubt it, actually.
Well,
And the question is what happens, right? Well, it's already happening. It's already happening when you have Ghetto Yaz community, when you have the black community, unfortunately, very impoverished, when the majority of people who are poor in this city are from racial minority groups, when the most poor single mothers are also part of the racial minority groups. And what happens, you have a public conflict and a sense of disconnect. You have people going to crime. You have the highest drop rate in the school board now in Toronto are amongst Somalian and Portuguese. Portuguese.
Just a second. Why are you lumping all racial minorities together as if they're all one big minority? That's not the case. We have a multitude of minorities, and they fare in very differential ways. Some minorities have very different experiences in this country than others. Some minority groups, kids do way better in school than others. Some do way better in school than white kids. We were talking about this the other day.
Well, that's not what the study shows. The study shows clearly that the
majority. Look at people who are
majority.
at the top of the class in high schools in this city.
That's not the
You know,
comments. The
they're
comments has
all
to do with the
minority
sense
kids.
of marginalization, the
So
sense
what
of
I'm
exclusion.
saying is, why are you stereotyping racial minorities by lumping them all together?
It's not a question of
It seems to me
stereotyping.
to be,
It's the reality.
you
It's
know,
the
silly.
numbers. The studies show that clearly that the group here in Toronto of people who are the most poorer, who have the highest feeling of marginalization, are a racial minority groups.
We also have some of the richest communities are also racial minorities, and some of the most successful.
Tony wants to follow up.
Excuse me.
I just want to pose it maybe in a different way. We constantly hear that immigrants, ethnic communities should leave their cultural heritage, ethnicity at the custom door. If they do that, how do the two largest ethnic communities, English Canada, French Canada, how do they deal with that? In other words, we swear allegiance to the Queen. We talk about Canadian, we're talking about letting people leave their baggage at the door, but the two mainstream cultures are actually embracing those and expecting others to embrace their cultural baggage and heritage. So how do we solve that? Thank you.
But you see, I don't
Can't you
think
ask
we
some
do.
easy questions? Those are two bloody hard questions. Go
See,
ahead.
I don't think we do. I don't think we do ask people to check their cultures at the door, whether that culture is Scottish or Somali. We expect everyone who comes to the country to buy in to some of the key assumptions of the country, that it embraces a charter of rights and freedoms within a constitution, that it is a liberal democratic state, and that those founding values were indeed the products of the French and British cultures. But the very reason people come to Canada or to wherever it is they come is that they find themselves attracted to the place, to its values, to its diversity, to its prosperity, and to all of those things. So I don't see why there should be any need, first of all, for anyone to feel that we need to become any more of a melting pot than we ever were, and we never were that much of one, or why we need to worry about new arrivals to Canada somehow rejecting the fundamentals of the Constitution and of the liberal democratic state, because I don't see an iota of evidence that anybody in this country who's coming to this country with a tiny, tiny number of exceptions does reject it.
Many
And
of
we've
Sita?
certainly seen institutions making efforts to actually have programs and activities which recognize that difference. For example, materials are published in many languages in the school system. Many workplaces have religious observance policies, or may have prayer rooms where people can take time out during the day. And and there are numerous activities like that that go on increasingly in institutions. In fact, the Human Rights Code makes some very specific provisions for accommodation. So, you know, I don't know that it's actually true that we expect people to be either English or French. I just don't, I haven't seen.
Okay, over here,
that.
folks. Many of you have heard of the Canadian Ethnocultural Council. Here's its new head, Peter Ferreira. Welcome.
Hi,
you wanted
Steve,
to say?
thank you. Well, I came in with the idea of speaking a little bit about the CC and to congratulate the Prime Minister in appointing Jason Kenney to this new portfolio. But while I hear all these comments, I kind of lived all these experiences. I came from Portugal. I lived in Little Portugal, grew up here. I'm president of the Portuguese National Congress. We understand that our community is one of those communities that is not succeeding at the same level as others.
You want to rip up multiculturalism, as one of our guests says tonight?
No, no. In fact, I embrace multiculturalism, not because I'm the president of the Ethnocultural Council, but in part it's because I've lived it. I'm also a former senior immigration officer with 30 years of experience. I'm presently a paralegal consultant with offices in India and in the Middle East, and 70 to 80% of my clients are South Asians and Arab and others. And on top of that, my son is dating a Pakistani Canadian who happens to be a Muslim.
What do you think about that?
I'm amazed. I'm amazed that.
Are you,
but, you know,
are you cool with it, though?
I'm cool with it, and at the same time, that's what Canada is, and we have challenges. I mean, obviously, we don't live in a perfect world, but the world is looking to us. Australia is looking to learn from us. New Zealand and others are looking to us. I think it would be a mistake to accept the idea of a melting pot. Trudeau was right on. We're the only country, I believe, in the world that has a Multiculturalism Act. I'm just saddened that this government, though, for a year, avoided naming a minister or a Secretary of State.
I want to get Binoy on this because it sounds like you've got some competition here.
What's your name?
Peter.
Peter. Yeah, you have a job to do anyway. As you know, as very clearly you had to say what you had to say. I wouldn't expect anything else from you.
But you think he's saying what he doesn't? Hang on, Binoy. Hang on. Do you think he doesn't believe what he's saying?
No. His defense of multiculturalism was expected. I mean, I would, you know, he is supposed to say that as the head of ethnocultural.
Yeah, but one presumes he wouldn't take the job if he didn't believe it.
So, what my problem is, this whole concept of multiculturalism, the act itself, who has it benefited since it got assent in 1988 or something? I did some research. Who has it benefited? Which community has it benefited?
What's the
act
answer?
itself, multiculturalism.
What's the answer?
No one.
Nobody?
Nobody. Because the way I look at it, I think Canada, like John said, I mean, it's a very clever line he used. I mean, it's very nice coming from a writer. It also shows a clever writer can sell bad ideas, you know, and make it attractive. Because
That's my job.
Success of a country, the failure is because the failure is a nation. Because you had a problem with English and French Canada. You, when I say specifically you, I mean the white people and the French white people. And then you bring in a third dimension. That was already a dysfunctional family, a husband and wife fighting situation. Then you bring a third man or a woman into the situation. That was the native people. That was a native nation, First Nation. And then you have sometime in the last 20 years have brought in a whole bunch of other nations. It's a very dysfunctional situation. And then again, back to the same question, who is Canadian, what is Canadian? People are growing up, people like me who have come here, we are totally, utterly confused. So we go
Let
back
me get
to our
Mohammed on
culture.
that. Mohammed, can I get you to react to that? Do you think we're a dysfunctional family here where everybody's confused?
I don't think so. No, I think we're a family who have this power struggle, where it's either the male who is the dominant figure or the female. And that's where we have to find consensus. I think the Canadian family and their multiculturalism should be a role model for the rest of the families. Inclusive, generous, diverse, and accommodating. But the problem is you have one side of the families who's taking advantage of the others. I mean, we bring people here with PhDs, surgeon, architect, and they end up driving taxis. Not like the taxi profession is something wrong, but it's not fair. We bring people who aspire to enhance their situation and their family situation, and they end up at the lower scale of the society. And I mean, yeah, there are some minorities who are doing better, but they're really the minority of the minority.
Okay, but Mohammed, the assumption underlying that statement is that it is all the fault of the society welcoming these new people, as opposed to any culpability on the part of those who are coming over here with those kinds of expectations. Is that
no,
fair?
No, that's not what I said. I think there is an adjustment. I think when Canada used to embrace an immigration from Europe, which is a white, Judeo-Christian, Protestant immigration, we didn't face that problem because they were able to integrate more harmoniously to this country. Now we're bringing people from other religion, other colors, and that's where the clash starts. And that's the issue.
Jeffrey, how do you know when an immigrant has tried his or her best to succeed?
Well, you know, I don't know if we have, the way we have of assessing success is just to look at how much money people are making. And we know that the immigrants do have like a discounted value in the labor market. And there's a lot of debate as to why that is, but that is certainly there. And survey data show that immigrants are aware of this. They're aware of discounting of foreign qualifications, and it's an issue in minority communities, has been for some time.
Sita, a follow-up to you. Immigrants succeed here for a number of reasons. One is that maybe we do a very good job welcoming them. Another is they work their butts off and achieve the success that we've been talking about. Most of our discussion follows on the former. Should we be focusing more on the latter?
On the latter, in terms of why they don't succeed? Or?
Yeah, the focus seems to be on, is our society doing a good enough job welcoming people here, rather than, is there enough individual initiative on the part of newcomers to integrate and to do well?
I think that there's a lot of initiative that they have. I think that the problems of immigration in the future will again be underutilization of folks. And I think that, you know, Mohammed and Jeffrey have spoken to those issues. In the future, I think that the problems will be in education, will be in the school system, in terms of whether or not there are sufficient resources for those children to succeed within the schools. What we've actually seen is a stripping away of support systems to the main classroom, social workers, you know, educational assistants, and so on and so forth. And if education isn't, you know, for the children of immigrants and so on, if education is one of the primary ways of success, I think that that's actually where we're going to have to spend a lot of our time and resources, making sure that the children of current and future generations will be able to participate in all aspects of the society.
Question back here, please. Go ahead, ma'am.
Yes, what I want to just put forward is that I have an issue with culturalism, the whole notion of culture, that is a social construction. It doesn't have, it's an abstraction, and that by insisting on this cultural identity, what is sort of suppressed is the fact that we're individuals first. And then by matter of birth or choice, we choose a culture to belong to or a group to belong to and identify. But really what I don't see in Canada is an emphasis placed on being an individual first. And I so much resent when people continually harp on whether I'm white. Like, I feel like, you know, Colbert, you know, I'm colorblind. And you can't be allowed to say that. This insistence on completely always harping as to color of skin, when in fact, you know, my color is more pink. I'm not a white person, but that's not even allowed to be said. So I really, really think that people should be judged on their actions as an individual. And who they are as a culture is meaningless. It's a frill about being in this world that we can have an identity that's cultural, but it really is not a significant part of who we are as beings.
I want to get some feedback on that. Jeffrey?
It's based on those sorts of principles that this sort of research is done. The question is, are those principles actually being lived out in everyday Canadian society? And what the research suggests is that it's not, and that the society is not colorblind, and that there are difficulties that arise between groups, so that following from that general set of premises, there's an agenda, following the title of your program, there's an agenda to be addressed, to try to make sure that that value system that she was expressing does actually get realized in Canadian society, because I think most people agree that with those ideas.
Yeah, I'd like to comment on that. If somebody is somebody who's inclined to discriminate, they're not going to take the time to find out whether or not you're a person or an individual with ideas. They're going to be responding based on what you look like, what your color of your skin is, how you dress, if you're wearing any sort of cultural garb. So it's, so discrimination often gets in the way of getting to actually understand or know some other person as a human being and for who they are.
Just before I go to this gentleman's question, Don Gilmore wrote something in the current issue of The Walrus, which I'd like to just put on the screen here for everybody to see and to hear. There is a danger, Don Gilmore wrote, there's a danger that the combination of regional alienation and the lack of attachment that immigrants feel will turn the country into a vast abstraction, a cross between a larger, less lucrative version of Hong Kong and John Lennon's Imagine, a postmodern experiment rather than the world's most successful multinational state. Who here fears Don Gilmore's vision of the future? Anybody on side? John?
I'm worried about a possible version of it. Certainly the country, and immigration is a very large part of this, the country is turning into 6 large cities with a whole bunch of bush in between. And the question of the depopulation of much of the country, basically all of rural Canada, all of Atlantic Canada, much of Quebec, much of the prairies, into 6 or 7 large cities, is a problem with several dimensions. One of them is that it ends up becoming race-based because the declining rural, impoverished areas are white, and the expanding cities, however much poverty there may be in them, are affluent and multicultural. And also because immigrants are not leaving the cities and going into the rest of the country and are not getting the experience of the rest of the country and are not bringing to the rest of the country the tremendous assets that they have.
Should I read you back to you right now?
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. In your last book, you said that you think that the government should implement the notwithstanding clause of the Constitution in order to force people, when they first come to this country, to live in places other than Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver, and that obviously when somebody challenges that in court because you're really infringing with their mobility rights, use the notwithstanding clause and make them.
And it's important to remember, though, not doing that so much not suggesting that so much for the sake of the immigrants, it's for the sake of the people in Charlottetown right now. We have got to find a way. We have got to find a way to reverse, or at least slow the erosion of much of the country, which is emptying out of population and economy. Otherwise, we're simply going to lose those parts of the country, and they're going to become wastelands.
Margaret?
Well, I disagree with John on that. I think the
Finally, we got you two to disagree.
Cities are where our future is. But I wanted to raise another point, which I think is a very recent phenomenon, but it's very important. And that is that with globalization, the world has shrunk. And with modern communications and airlines and all of that stuff, the world has shrunk so much that a lot of people still have a foot in where they've come from. It's not like 150 years ago where you had to get on a ship and cross the Atlantic and you knew you would never go back again and you would never see your relatives and you had to make, you had to make your future here. But here we have a world where we have Canadians, citizens, fighting in Somalia on both sides, I gather. We have Canadian citizens fighting in Iraq, maybe on both sides too. And there's a way in which you can, who was it who called Canada the world's finest hotel?
That was a good line.
There's a way in which you can live here, but also live somewhere else.
We got a minute and a half to go. I want to get this gentleman's question in. Go ahead, sir.
Oh, well, it has been quite an eye-opener for me to hear, to come here to listen to everybody talk about multiculturalism and start off talking about race without being honest or clear about it, talking about language, I guess it's implicit, which are the visible identifiers, social class, education, all these things that we bring with ourselves that may hinder or help us in our economic, first of all, participation here, social participation, and eventually in our cultural participation, which I would think that a culture is made out of a search of values and a sharing of values. It is a bit...
You're not hearing enough of that tonight? Sharing of values?
Yes, I have, but what is very interesting and very it's been quite an education to me, is that multiculturalism started being defined in terms of those visible tags, which are race and other ethnic participation. And by the way, I would defy anybody here to try and place where I came from before coming here to Canada.
I was just going to ask you, where? What's the answer?
Mexico.
Mexico.
But people tell me I don't look Mexican. And then I ask them, what is a Mexican supposed to look like?